So, Garrett, you are arguing that at the conclusion of today's session, you are going to place this video on the YouTube. Is that correct?
This is 100% guaranteed.
There you go. You heard
100%.
it on the YouTube, guaranteed 100%.
If it does not happen today, I will make all of you cookies next time.
I expect cookies.
Garrett, I can say right now, you are putting yourself out there.
I know.
You're taking a monumental risk in saying you'll buy everyone cookies. Well, let's go. Let's start now, and maybe some of our friends will be eventually coming after they are at their Interact meeting. But the beginning of the material for this test is going to start with the Treaty of Paris, 1783. So the Treaty of Paris, 1783, ends the Revolutionary War. And with the end of the Revolutionary War, we considered in class the aftermath. I mean, we fought the Revolutionary War. We talked about the battles in the Revolutionary. We talked about Yorktown, the aftermath of Yorktown, and then we ended with the Treaty of Paris, 1783. We talked a little bit about, the aftermath of that. And one of the things that we argued is that in the aftermath of the Revolution, there was a movement towards equality. And a part of that movement towards equality involved addressing slavery. So we said, okay, let's talk about all of the results of the Revolutionary War. How did the revolution affect religion? How did the revolution affect, politics? How did the revolution affect the economy and people and the standard of living? But one of the things that we looked at is how did the revolution affect social structure? And what we said is the ideas of the Declaration of Independence were that all men were created equal. And this is a movement towards equality. Well, how did this square with slavery? And we said that in the aftermath of the revolution, there was a recognition that slavery was inconsistent with the principles of the Declaration of Independence. And there was some action on that kind of recognition. That some states, mostly northern states, 8 of the 13 states, abolished slavery in the aftermath of the revolution. We also said that the international slaves trade was abolished in all the states. That it was easier to manumit slaves. In even the slave states, they talked about, in places like Virginia, whether or not to abolish slavery. But in 5 states in the aftermath of the revolution, slavery continued. Why did we say, even though we could make an argument that slavery was assaulted by the revolution, why does it continue even through the Constitution? Remember, we read Gouverneur Morris's kind of scathing indictment of slavery in the Constitution, yet it endures. What kind of explains that? And then we offered some kind of ideas. Yes, go ahead. Yeah, we talked about it being a necessary evil. That why is it necessary? I mean, anybody? Why would you say it's a necessary? This is recognition that it's evil. It's necessary in order to do what?
To sustain the economy.
Well, to sustain the economy and perpetuate the Union, right? It's clear that the southern states, particularly Georgia and South Carolina, aren't going to stay in the Union if they believe that there's anything that might threaten the institution of slavery. So the necessity of slavery is a necessity economically for the South and politically for everyone to maintain unity. Well, okay, we said that certainly the aftermath of the revolution was significant for its effect on slavery. But what was interesting to us is how Americans are going to address giving life to the principles of the Declaration of Independence in government. And what we said was that during the Revolution, all of the individual states reconstituted their state governments. And they created new state governments that were established with bicameral legislatures, and they weakened the governors of their states and the upper house of the legislature, and they all passed bills of rights, and we talked about that. But we said we were far more interested in the sort of central government that was created in the aftermath of the revolution. And we said the first system of central government, which was intended to to give life to the principles of the Declaration of Independence, was the Articles of Confederation. And we talked about the Articles of Confederation. We said the Articles of Confederation were approved by the Continental Congress in 1781, but they were not fully ratified until they were approved, I'm sorry, they were approved in 1777, right? Or 1778.
Okay, come on, Brenda, please report your letter.
1777, but they really weren't ratified by all the states until 1781. What delayed the ratification of the Articles of Confederation? Do you remember? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, they wanted all 13 states, and some states refused to ratify the Articles. Why?
They did not have it based on population.
No, that was the Constitution. Hold on, that's a good one.
Land claims?
Yes, land claims. Remember, what delayed the Articles of Confederation was that some states claimed land west of the Appalachian Mountains, and some states had no land claims. What was the eventual resolution of that? What was the eventual resolution of this dispute over Western land claims? I mean, that paved the way for ratification of the Articles of Confederation. What was agreed by all the states? Does anybody remember? Of course you remember. Yes, go ahead. Yes, the states that had land claims ceded their land claims to the new federal government. And that land west of the Appalachian Mountains would now be the common land of the United States. And it would be divided into now independent states that would join the Union on the basis of equality. Okay, now, we said under the Articles of Confederation there were certainly problems. What was probably the biggest limitation of the federal government that was created by the Articles? What was probably the biggest limitation that government had? Yes. Yes, it could not tax. Remember, under the Articles of Confederation, the federal government was made up of a unicameral legislature. What does unicameral mean? Maria Reynolds, do you remember what unicameral means? One house Congress. As opposed to a bicameral legislature, which means a two-house Congress. So under the Articles of Confederation, there was one Congress in which each state had one vote. Remember, we said that in that Congress, to pass most important pieces of legislation, it required 2/3 of the state to consent. And regardless of what they did, that Congress could not raise a direct tax that the people had to pay. So how did that Congress get money, Daniel Patrick Farrell?
Taxation.
No, they couldn't tax. We just said that.
I wasn't paying attention.
It's hard to believe. Yes, go ahead.
They pretty much had to ask the states nicely for money.
Yes, they had to ask the states nicely for money, and the states rarely complied. And so one of Congress's biggest problems is an inability to pay their debts. Among other problems with Congress was an inability to regulate commerce, to raise an army. And its inability to raise an army is seen with Shays' Rebellion. What state was Shays' Rebellion in? And what impact did Shays... Let me go, Daniel. You are paying attention now. Yes.
Massachusetts.
It was in western Massachusetts, correct? And farmers in western Massachusetts were disgruntled with their conditions. And so what did they do? What did the farmers in western Massachusetts do because of their unhappiness? What's really the core of Shays' Rebellion? So the Shayites, as they were called, western Massachusetts farmers were frustrated with the lack of currency. They were frustrated with foreclosures on their farms. They were frustrated because they weren't paid what was due to them for their military service. So they respond by doing what? Yes, go ahead.
Or they attack federal officers.
They eventually attack a federal arsenal, but remember, they shut down the civil courts in western Massachusetts. They prevent judges from foreclosing on property. They disrupt the governments in those areas, and eventually they take and attack a federal arsenal in Massachusetts. An army is raised by the business interests in Boston to put down Shays' Rebellion. And remember, Shays' Rebellion is one of the things that contributes to a desire for a more powerful central government, for two reasons. One reason is there were people that feared civil unrest, that the masses would not be able to be subdued by government to provide order and stability. The other fear was that the Shayites would be able to influence state governments in order to kind of threaten minority rights. So these things coalesce in a desire for a more powerful national government. And eventually, Congress under the Articles is going to agree to call for a convention to convene in the summer of 1787 for the purpose of what? When Congress called for the convention that we now call the Constitutional Convention, the stated purpose of that convention was not to write a new constitution. What was it to do? To modify the Articles of Confederation. Now, we said that 12 of the 13 states sent delegates to that convention. And many of the delegates that arrived there were not people who were associated with the Declaration of Independence or had been prominent leaders in the Revolution. In fact, there were notable prominent leaders of the Revolution who were not part of the Philadelphia Constitutional Convention. Name one. If you were to name one, Stephanie, which one would you name? So the delegates that arrived in Philadelphia for the purpose of modifying the Articles of Confederation went to Philadelphia. Not all of them had actively, fully participated or were leaders in the Revolution. There were some notable leaders of the Revolution who were not in attendance in the Constitutional Convention. And my question to you, dear Stephanie, was to name one. Right.
Please report to the office. Sapphire Mason to the office.
Thomas Jefferson was not there. Who else was not there? Yes.
Adams.
John Adams was not there. And, you know, I mean, George Washington and Benjamin Franklin, who were probably the most prominent people in the country at that time, were both in attendance at the Constitutional Convention. Now, we said that the driving figure at the Constitutional Convention was who? Now he is considered to be the father of the Constitution. Go ahead, Jason. Madison. What was the name of Madison's plan that drives the agenda? Go ahead. The Virginia Plan. Now, the Virginia Plan is Madison's plan for the organization of government, particularly Congress. The alternative to the Virginia Plan, does anybody remember that was? There were people that rejected the Virginia Plan. What was the alternative? The New Jersey Plan. Now, the New Jersey Plan and the Virginia Plan represented a dispute between big states and small states. What was at issue? The great compromise of the Constitution resolves this dispute. But what was the issue? Yes?
Population concerns slavery.
Yes, I mean, that's exactly right. The issue was population versus representation by states. But let's call the issue representation. How would people be represented in Congress, in the legislature? Would representation be by population, what was favored by the big states, or would representation be by states, what was favored by the small states? And remember, the great compromise of the Constitution was the compromise between big states and small states, in which one house would be based on population and one house would be based on states. And that's the great compromise of the Constitution. Now, there was a dispute in the Constitutional Convention between big states and small states. There was also a dispute in the Constitutional Convention between North and South. What was that dispute about? The dispute, Joe, between North and South was what?
Slavery, whether and what the representation would be.
Yes, how and whether to count slaves for purposes of representation and purposes of taxation. Malay, what was the eventual compromise over whether or not to count slaves for purposes of taxation and representation? The 3/5 compromise. What did that mean, dear Malay?
Every 5 slaves counted for 3 people.
Yes, every 5 slaves counted for 3 people for purposes of taxation and purposes of representation. Now, after the compromises over the Constitution, we talked a little bit about the presidency and the Electoral College. We said that the delegates to the Constitutional Convention proposed that it be ratified by each of the 13 states in a special convention. That each state would hold a special convention, that delegates would be elected by the voters of that state, and then those delegates would vote whether or not to ratify the Constitution based on what they perceived to be its merits. Once 9 of the 13 states had ratified the Constitution, it would become it would become the law of the land. There was a ferocious debate between those who supported the Constitution, who eventually called themselves Federalists, and their opponents, who eventually the Federalists, called the Anti-Federalists. To the Anti-Federalists, the biggest flaw in the Constitution was what? I mean, the Anti-Federalists were not really organized necessarily, but there was sort of this overriding consensus, Jason, that the biggest flaw was what? It did not include a Bill of Rights. And so, in many of the states, the Constitution was only ratified with the assurance that a Bill of Rights would be added to it. Now, in order to support, those who supported the Constitution were called Federalists, and their views in support of the Constitution were articulated in a series of newspaper articles that were called the Federalist Papers or the Federalists. Now, the authors of the Federalist Papers were who? Who were the 3 authors? Go ahead, Jake.
Hamilton, Madison.
Jay. Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay. And they were written to convince the state of New York to ratify the Constitution. The most famous of the Federalist Papers in some ways is Federalist 10. What did Federalist 10 address? Federalist 10 addressed an issue of opposition, that the opponents of the Constitution said it won't work because. And in Federalist 10, Madison is going to address that argument. Go ahead, Jordan.
They argued that you need to be a small republic.
Mm-hmm. Yes. The opponents of the Constitution said there is no historical precedent for a large republic ever being successful. It will always degenerate into a dictatorship. So the only way to have Republican government is to have it small. And what Madison argues in Federalist 10 is that it is not only possible to have a large republic, but it is practical to have a large republic. Now, okay, the Constitution is ratified by 11 of the 13 states. It becomes the law of the land. Eventually, even North Carolina and Rhode Island will ratify the Constitution and join in the new union. So now we talked about launching the new government under the Constitution. And we said that once the Constitution was ratified, all of the states, I guess the 11 states that were participating, held elections. And they elected members of the House of Representatives, and the state legislatures appointed members to the Senate, and the legislatures appointed electors to the Electoral College who cast their ballot for president, and George Washington was unanimously elected as the president. We talked about the first government taking its seats in New York in 1789. And we talked about the challenges that that government had. We said that one of the challenges that faced that new government was to convince the anti-federalists that this new system of central government would not threaten their liberties. Now remember, the big argument against the Constitution is that it would create a powerful central government that would be analogous to Britain, and it would threaten the liberties of the people in the country that they had just fought to achieve. And so what was it that would convince those people who were suspicious of this federal government that their liberties would be safe? What did the Federalists promise that they would do that they are now going to deliver, Anika? Yes. And who is largely responsible for shepherding the Bill of Rights through the House and the Senate? Yes, James Madison, who is a leader in the first U.S. House of Representatives. Now, one of the things that we said this new government had to do, besides convince the anti-federalists that their liberties were safe, is to fill in the structure of government. That the Constitution was vague, and it allowed for the first Congress and subsequent Congress to adjust the federal government based on the needs at a given time. And so there were precedents established, and the details of government were filled in. What was one thing that was innovated by Washington that was not part of the original Constitution? Go ahead. Yes, a cabinet. Now, we did say that Congress divided government into departments, and each department would have a secretary of, not of defense, of war, a secretary of treasury, a secretary of state. So what's the difference between having secretaries of departments and having a cabinet? What does Washington really do, Julie? To establish a cabinet?
Oh, he chose the leaders of each department.
He chose the leaders of each department, which were confirmed by the Senate. And who was the first Secretary of Treasury?
Hamilton.
Who was his first Secretary of State?
Jefferson.
Jefferson. First Secretary of War was Knox. But what made them a cabinet? What did Washington do? Yes. Yes, he met with them for advice. And nowhere in the Constitution was that something that was built in to the federal government. Now, we said in that first cabinet, Hamilton might have been the most important person. Why so? Why would Hamilton, yes, go ahead, Mary. Pardon me? Well, he wanted to create a national bank, but creating a national bank, it was part of the larger problem. What was the larger problem facing the country? Go ahead. Well, the debt and financial problems in general. And so Congress is going to ask Hamilton for a report on public credit. He's going to provide a report on the national bank and a report on manufacturing. In all of those circumstances, Hamilton is going to advocate for an energetic federal government that is going to take action to promote economic development, economic diversity, and to expand, the country, and to expand the power of the federal government. And we went through Hamilton's financial programs, right? We talked about funding at par, we talked about assumption, we talked about a national bank, and we talked about taxes and tariffs. The national bank is controversial. It's controversial because of the nature of the bank, and there's also a constitutional issue that is associated with the national bank. What is that constitutional issue? Go ahead. Well, no, we're talking about the constitutional issue associated with chartering a bank. Go ahead, Molly.
There will be too much money and too
No, that's not a constitutional issue. Yes, go ahead.
They weren't sure if they can do it.
Yes, they weren't sure if they could do it. right? They weren't sure if they could do it. So now we're saying, okay, assumption, funding at par were ways of dealing with the national debt. And there was disagreements about assumption and funding at par, but no constitutional disagreements. A constitutional issue is when we say, can we do this? I mean, the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, right? Everything that government does on any level must conform to the Constitution. That's today. Then, anything that the federal government did had to conform to the Constitution. So the question became, could the federal government, Congress, charter a bank or business? And the reason that was in question is nowhere in the Constitution did it say that Congress had the authority to do that. And if it didn't say it, then you couldn't do it, or Congress couldn't do it. What is that interpretation of the Constitution called? If you say strict, the strict interpretation of the Constitution. Now, remember, when Washington considered vetoing the bank, right, because there was opposition to its constitutionality, he asked for the opinions of Jefferson, he asked for the opinion of Randolph, he asked for the opinion of Hamilton, whether or not they believed the federal government had the constitutional authority to charter the bank. And remember, Jefferson and Randolph said no. Nowhere in the Constitution does this authority exist, and if it doesn't say it, you can't do it. That's the strict interpretation of the Constitution. The bank is unconstitutional. Now, Hamilton disagreed. What did Hamilton base his disagreement on? What clause in the Constitution, Jason? The elastic clause in the Constitution, which suggests that Congress can do what is necessary and proper, right, in order to fulfill its stated responsibilities. And the bank was chartered for 20 years, 1791 to 1711. We just said today that in 1711, the bank went out of existence. And the Republicans, who were in control of Congress in 1811, I'm sorry, it was 1791 to 1811. In 1811, the bank went out of existence, and Republicans were in control of Congress, let it go out of existence. But those same Republicans are going to recharter a second bank of the United States in the aftermath of the War of 1812, which, you know, we were talking a little bit today about how that's inconsistent with traditional Republican ideology. Well, it's flagrantly inconsistent. If you think about it, the Republicans argued the bank was A, a bad idea, and B, unconstitutional. So now, in 1816, that same group of people are going to think it's A, a good idea, and B, constitutional. Right? So it's kind of ironic. Also, we said what was controversial about Hamilton's financial program was taxes and tariffs, particularly an excise tax on whiskey, which prompts what we know as the Whiskey Rebellion. What was Washington's eventual response? Go ahead, Antonio.
Something like 13,000.
Washington dispatches an army of 13,000 troops to put down the Whiskey Rebellion. Yes?
I just want to let you know that Mrs. Scott, the German teacher, claims that her great-grandfather was the judge who ruled on the whiskey.
Is that right?
That's what she said.
I don't doubt it, because Mrs. The German teacher, she is a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution. And to be a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution, you have to prove a lineage directly back to someone who participated in the American Revolution. So I do not doubt the veracity of what she's saying, because she actually had to prove it.
I didn't know if I believed her.
Yeah, you should believe her, I mean, because they scrutinize that pretty carefully, you know, to get that. But the Whiskey Rebellion is a big deal. It is eventually, incidentally, half of you that wrote your essays thought that Washington handled the Whiskey Rebellion really well. The other half of you said you didn't think so, right? So, I mean, there were some of you that said it was good. In your essays, you said it was good. Some of you didn't bother to explain why. That doesn't help, right? Some of you said it wasn't good. That's okay too, but again, didn't bother to explain why. That doesn't help. Some of you said it was good and kind of explained why, and that's good, right? And some of you said it was bad and kind of explained why, and that's good. Now, Hamilton's collective actions are going to create a response from Madison and others who believe that these actions are not what they had in mind as being the legitimate powers of the federal government. Those people who eventually support Madison and Jefferson in their opposition to Hamilton's financial program are going to eventually call themselves Republicans, right? So the Republican opposition emerges over Hamilton's financial proposals. The Federalist support for their proposals emerges, and this is the beginning of a political division that ends up with a tenuous two-party system. That two-party system is further exacerbated by foreign affairs, particularly the French Revolution. The French Revolution is something that is celebrated by the Republicans who want more influence by the people, more equality, a weaker central government that is less likely to trample on the liberties of the people. They support the French Revolution. They support France's battle with England to consummate their revolution. And so the political divisions that are created by Hamilton's financial proposals are intensified by disputes over the French Revolution. Those disputes over the French Revolution are going to come to come home to the United States over citizen Genet. And Genet arrives here, and prior to his arrival, Washington proclaims neutrality. And one of the interesting things we said about this is that Washington proclaims neutrality despite us having a treaty obligation with France, but our neutrality tends to benefit the French. And so the British are going to respond to our neutrality by impressment and harassing our shipping. Now notice something here. If you're following along with our conversation, and you look at the War of 1812 and you think, you know, why did we fight this war? It seemed like so unnecessary. Well, Washington is struggling with asserting our neutrality and in some ways our independence and sovereignty as early as 1793. You know, so Washington is running into problems asserting our neutrality, and in some ways we consider the assertion of our neutrality kind of a recognition of our independence. So eventually when they say in 1812, we've done everything, there's something to be said for that. You know, we've tried this. What is eventually Washington's, America's response to British and Britain actions? Trying to negotiate a terrible treaty, which is Jay's Treaty, right? So Jay's Treaty is an attempt to avoid fighting over the assertion of our neutrality. So rather than fight the British like we did in 1812, right, in 1893, we signed Jay's Treaty, which causes a tremendous backlash from the Republicans who think it is humiliating, right? Now, that might be why Washington in 1796, before he leaves office, frustrated with, kind of all of the criticisms against him, he warns, don't get involved in entangling alliances with European powers. And that's also why you can see in the aftermath of the War of 1812, we talked about this a little bit today, that they advocated for the American system. We're not going to get involved in European powers. We're going to separate ourselves, fully from Europe and the Atlantic system and the way that they do things and their culture and their ideology and fully proclaim and consummate our independence. And that's kind of what we're talking about in this period of internal development. Now, we also said that Jay's Treaty made the French mad. So they started to harass our ships. Now, Washington is gone, and this becomes Adams's problem. What does Adams do in response to France violating our neutrality? Yeah, go ahead.
Doesn't he send an envoy?
He sends envoys, and how does that go? It ends up in what do we call, yes, go ahead. The XYZ affair. And the XYZ affair is this kind of flagrant demand for a bribe by the French in order to just talk to them. When it becomes known, anti-French sentiment bubbles up to a quasi-war with France. Now, we are never going to be in a full-scale war with France, but we're almost in a war with France. We built up our military in anticipation for a French invasion. Shots are fired in the Caribbean. We create the Department of Navy, which incidentally, it is going to be the Navy created here by Adams that is going to be the Navy that has success in the War of 1812. Nevertheless, one of the byproducts of that anti-French sentiment is the Alien and Sedition Acts. What were the Alien and Sedition Acts a general attempt to do? The Alien and Sedition Acts. A general attempt to do what? Yeah, go ahead, Stephanie.
Didn't they allow the president to deport any foreigner that posed the threat? It didn't allow anyone to publish anything against you.
Nicely said. Yes, it restricted what foreigners could do in their citizenship, and it muzzled opposition by the Republicans against the Federalist government. What was the Republican response, Joel, to the Alien and Sedition Acts? In order to kind of claim they weren't constitutional, what did the Republicans do? How do they assert the claim that the Alien and Sedition Acts were unconstitutional?
They couldn't. They didn't think the Supreme Court had the power to do that.
So where did they go?
Kentucky and Virginia.
The Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. So the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions are going to be the Republican assertion that the Alien and Sedition Acts were unconstitutional and could be declared so by the legislatures of the states. Now eventually, the question there, and let's just fully flesh this out, because we have questions later on the test, but we'll skip over them in the review. The question here is, who gets to determine whether acts of Congress are consistent with the Constitution or not? And what Jefferson and Madison were saying in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions were that if an act of Congress is unconstitutional, the state legislatures can determine that. And they can deem them to be unconstitutional. Now, later, in the case of Marbury versus Madison, John Marshall is going to establish a precedent that the Supreme Court is the final determiner or arbiter of constitutionality. That the last say is not the state legislatures, but in fact the Supreme Court. Now, in that kind of dispute, you can sort of see the Federalist Republican ideology coming to the forefront. The Republicans are going to like the idea that legislatures who are close to the people are going to have the last say in constitutionality. Federalists are going to like the idea that kind of lordly elite Supreme Court justices that are insulated from the will of the people are going to have the last say. So really this dispute kind of accentuates the difference between the Republicans, who have great confidence in the will of the people, and the Federalists, who are suspicious. And that's why the Republicans are going to support the French Revolution despite its excesses, and the Federalists are going to fear it because of its excesses. Well, okay. We said that when Adams got the opportunity to make peace, he took it. And that resulted in the United States being all dressed up and nowhere to go in 1800 when he was running for re-election. So Adams is defeated in 1800 for his re-election to the presidency, and Jefferson wins the presidency in 1800. Now, with Jefferson's victory, he proclaims that what he is going to do, or what it represented, was another revolution. And Jefferson is going to try to implement into government, with a Republican House and a Republican Senate, the Republican ideology of the size and the scope of the national government. And to some extent he does that. You know, with limiting the size of the Army, limiting the size of the Navy, you know, and reducing the federal bureaucracy. But in other ways, Jefferson is going to kind of adopt Federalist ideology. And one of the circumstances is with the Louisiana Purchase. You know, we talked about the details of the Louisiana Purchase and, you know, how, you know, Napoleon acquires the territory and then decides that he no longer wants to hold it and decides that he's going to sell it to the United States for $15 million. You know, an interesting thing, and this is off the subject, but an interesting thing is that Britain and Spain never recognized the Louisiana Purchase. They said that Napoleon wasn't authorized to sell it, so it still belonged to Spain. So there was suspicion if Britain would have taken New Orleans in that battle and then found that the war was actually over, instead of returning New Orleans to America, they would have returned it to Spain, right? Because they didn't recognize it. I know that doesn't happen. You know, we don't know if it would have happened. But anyways, how did Jefferson behave like a Federalist in the Louisiana Purchase? So he said that, yeah, go ahead, Joel.
His loose interpretation of the Constitution.
He loosely interprets the Constitution in itself. How so, dear Noah? How does he loosely interpret the Constitution?
Because the Constitution doesn't say that you can make a purchase like that, but then
He did anyways. So nowhere in the Constitution did it authorize the government to do that, but he did it, right? Kind of using the broad interpretation of the Constitution. We talked about Jefferson being overwhelmingly elected in 1804 and having great success domestically and in foreign affairs. But in his second term, he struggles in foreign affairs over what? What's the problem, Meredith, in his second term? Go ahead, Marianne. While Marianne is looking up, in the interest of time, yes, go ahead. Well, the Embargo Act is the big thing. But the problem, I guess I would say, was war in Europe. You know, it gets back to that. You know, the problem that emerged in 1793 that Washington struggled with was neutrality. Jefferson gets a brief reprieve in having to deal with that. I mean, Adams struggled with the same thing. But Jefferson gets a brief reprieve because there's this kind of, you know, short period of no fighting in Europe, so there's no issue of neutrality. But when Britain takes control of the seas and Napoleon takes control of the land in continental Europe, now Jefferson is in a real jam. Our neutrality is again threatened, impressment, etc. And there's kind of a flagrant attempt at impressment. What was that? What ship? Go ahead, Jason. Yeah, the Chesapeake incident. And in that case, you know, Jefferson responds to the Chesapeake incident by having Congress pass the Embargo Act. And the Embargo Act was an embargo on exports from the United States to Britain and to France and to everyone. And we know this. We know that the Embargo Act doesn't work. And that we know that Jefferson's successor, Madison, is going to struggle with that same neutrality. I mean, this is a problem that Washington faced. This is a problem that Adams faces. This is a problem that Jefferson faces. This is a problem that Madison faces. And so when those war hawks, who were those war hawks? Remember we mentioned the war hawks? When those war hawks say that enough is enough, and now we should take action, right? They are basing that on a long history of both Britain and France, but most notably Britain, kind of refusing to recognize our neutrality, almost regardless of what we do, our complaints, or what kind of economic sanctions we try to lay on them. Who were the war hawks, incidentally? Who were the war hawks? Yes, go ahead, Nick.
They were like the younger Republicans who were coming in and they wanted freedom for
Yeah, pardon me, go ahead.
That was their like main entrance.
Korea Johnson to the front entrance. Korea Johnson to the front entrance.
Yes, they were these younger, militaristic, nationalistic Republicans who believed that enough was enough and pushed Madison for war. Now, we talked at length over the past couple of days about Madison's decision to go to war, the opposition to war, the lack of clarity of war aims, the lack of preparedness in preparing for war. But despite that conversation, we said that the American Navy does fairly well in the War of 1812. Ship-on-ship engagements, privateers, the Navy performs admirably. The Army outside of the Battle of New Orleans is kind of badly defeated in many cases in the War of 1812. The Battle of New Orleans is a significant battle because of the nature of it. It's an important city. It's a major, significant British army taking on a lesser American force that was... The Battle of New Orleans in some ways kind of vindicates everything that is American, right? Okay, we don't have a professional army. We just got guys with guns. Okay, we've got all kind of ethnicities here. We've got African Americans, we've got Irishmen, we've got all of these ethnicities, we've got French, we've got Creoles, we've got all of this hodgepodge of population, farmers, others that come together and can defeat the forces of the British. It's almost a vindication for American republicanism and a denunciation of everything federalist. You need the British are great, their system is better. Well, here you go. Our kind of Republican ideology defeats them at New Orleans. So there's a lot of underlying things there as well. Oh, what was the Hartford Convention? Yes, go ahead.
It essentially ended the Federalist Party because they were sort of threatening the Congress to make amendments.
Yeah, the Hartford Convention was that convention of New England states that sent delegates to demand changes in the Constitution that would protect New England from legislation that would hurt it economically, like wars, like embargoes, and things like that. But there was an underlying threat of secession that was associated with it. We talked about the War of 1812 being a second war for economic independence, diplomatically and economically, right? Diplomatically in that Britain is going to finally recognize America's independence, that that a Republican government endures a war against Britain and turns back a legitimate army at New Orleans. And economically, we said it gives way to the American system. And the American system we described in class, in most of the classes today, we described the American system as including, a call for a national bank, a call for protective tariffs for manufacturing, and government-financed internal improvements. Now, over the next day, tomorrow, we are going to talk about the Monroe Doctrine, we are going to talk about the Missouri Compromise, and hopefully the Marshall Court. Right? Now, if we don't, we should have a test on Tuesday. So we'll see how it goes tomorrow. And those things will also be included in the test that we take either Monday or Tuesday. But we'll see what happens, seventh period tomorrow. All right, that's it for today. Well, it's 25 after. Isn't that the time we said we finished?
26 after, actually.
Oh, my. Look, you need to Look, do you ever get your mother was a teacher where? What do you think?
applied for robotics. Because I'm mad. I asked him, I'm like, hey, do you want me to come in or not? And he's just like, no, don't come. No, I can't.
Where you
No,
go?
you don't. Huh? Yeah.
Yeah.
Way to go.
So last year on the video, where you going? Cut it off.
Did I turn it off? Are you sure? Huh? Oh, he got it.